Okay. So yeah, so then so a belief in that so that shift really meant that you had to reorganize society. You had to rethink how order was going to become possible, because it was a very chaotic moment, time. And so sociologists began to write about or think about what this new social order was going to be like, what sorts of norms, what sorts of ideas of order were going to evolve. So this is the broader context in which we have discussed the aspects of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. Now, the kind of things that happened with the Industrial Revolution, as you must all be aware, is that, as I said, factories and industry became the dominant mode of organizing economic activity, and that you were no longer producing for yourself, you were producing for the other. So in the domestic mode of production, where you had domestic and agricultural mode of production, where you basically grew the crops that you wanted to, you fed yourself, your demands were met through that, and there was a kind of, in early times, you could think of a barter economy, but later on, again, even with the introduction of money, when you had a domestic mode of production, the needs were, met through sort of small-scale industries and so on, right? Now, with what happens with the change in the Industrial Revolution is that you have the mass production of goods for the first time, so that that it's possible to produce more and more. And also, of course, with the different sorts of innovations, that a variety of goods are now made available. So it's not just sort of goods that are being produced with simple technologies, but goods that are being produced with complex technologies, goods that are being produced on a mass scale. And therefore, the requirement for labor also increases. And this means that more and more people move out from this agricultural domestic mode of production into the industrial mode of production. As a result of this, there is a concentration of, of course, the concentration of industry is according to where the resources are. So when there is a concentration of resources and a concentration of the growth of industries, it means that more and more people settle in particular areas. So there is density of population, right? The number of people per, in a certain area increase. And because of this increase in density of population, you have what is called the processes of urbanization that begin. And behind all this is actually the sort of revolutionizing of modes of transport and communication. So because it's, so mass production of goods, again, mass production of goods is possible because you can now distribute differently because you have access to modes of transportation, new modes of transportation. So, so what we see then is that that urbanization, sort of proceeds at a kind of unprecedented rate, and overall, in a sort of social sense, just one second. Yeah. Just one second. Vaibhav, can you share the screen for that previous?
Sure, ma'am. You have to make me a post also for that.
It's the one on historical context.
Sure. You have to give me sharing rights.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So so then urbanization and because of all this, overall, there is a decline of religion as an organizing social force. So you begin with the idea that it's reason, it's possible to overcome your difficulties and social constraints through reason, through rationality. It's possible to take charge of your own life through through the application of reason. Um, and because of this, then overall, there is a decline of religion as an organizing and a binding force. Now,
Ma'am, could you tell me which slide to begin with?
huh?
Which slide to begin with?
Yeah, I'll just tell you. I was just doing a recap. Um, I think you can bring that up, the other forces of change. That's slide 13. Yeah. So we discussed, I think we've already discussed this, but if you remember, we said that, so when this happens, there is a kind of both the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution meant that there is a kind of egalitarianism with which society is attempting to operate, right? Where when you say that, okay, you're responsible for your own destiny, you can create your own destiny, you can, so that there is a sense in which the earlier unequal or the inequalities in society, you think can be addressed through this kind of application of reason. So if you remember the French Revolution, the very context of it was this, that that there was that there were oppressive social relations, and people were rebelling against these oppressive social relations, against the kind of social order that led to these oppressive social relations. So there, overall, one of the forces of change was this rise of socialist ideas, rise of ideas of social justice, of equality in society, of again, made stronger through the idea of adult universal franchise and so on. And the other idea that I wanted to discuss, and I think we did talk about it a little bit, is about feminist principles. That partly there's the impact of these egalitarian principles and the impact of this sort of trying to see everything with reason and rationality was also that you realize the way in which gender and gender relations were organized. And there was a sea change in the way in which gender relations were organized, especially as women also began to move out of the immediate domestic sphere into the public sphere for work, and there was an opening up of opportunities for all kinds of for both genders. Now, in this context, next slide, please. What Auguste Comte does is that he says that if you try to think about what is going on in society, how do you explain what is happening? And he felt that you can have a science by which you can predict, you can understand and control human behavior. So that's, that when you think of social reality, it is not something that is natural. It is not something that is divinely ordained, but it's really about the power and the relationship that is constructed as individuals engage with each other. So it is not something that is given, right? And so there are three things that he's talking about. One, that the scientific study of human society is possible, which means that you can have a discipline which replicates some of the principles of science with regard to the study of human society. Then he says that you have to understand that social reality is not naturally or divinely ordained. So it's not the realm of simply in the realm of nature, and nor is it simply in the realm of religion and God. But it is something that is constructed as individuals engage in with each other. So the relations of mutuality, respect, trust, oppression, power, all of those are constituted in social relations, and they're co-constituted, which means they're constituted as people engage with each other. And finally, that society sociology as a discipline can actually be used for the betterment of society. Now, why betterment of society? I think this is connected to the condition that he was writing in. He was writing in a condition that was a social condition that was just emerging out of serious oppression, that was just emerging out of deep inequalities. And he felt that, so you needed a science to understand what was happening in society. And you needed a science to then, so you could use sociology to then control human behavior, to take society on sort of a right and a good path, as it were. So, if you connect this to what we discussed about C. Wright Mills, you'll see that C. Wright Mills was actually disillusioned with how sociology. So, uh, Coate is sort of the earliest figure who's writing about, earliest sociologist who's writing about how a science of society is possible. What can a science of society do? And you have somebody like C. Wright Mills writing several, hundreds of years later, where he's saying that, look, sociology is not doing what it started out to do, because we are too caught up with with theory and with grand theory, and that we've lost the plot in a sense. And the plot really was what Comte was saying, that how can you use this to better understand society? How can you use this to better control a society? So, the three stages we've already discussed. And so this is broadly the sort of background within which sociology emerged. And if you remember this background, I think it will be easier for us to then try and understand the theoretical approaches and the different concepts that we will discuss as we go along. I think we have, for some reason, Vaibhav has dropped out of the meeting.
Ma'am,
He's
I
back.
have one doubt.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ma'am, you just said that Mill was not in favor of understanding the science of the sociology,
Yeah.
while the other sociologists said that we have to study the
No, what I'm
scientific
saying is, so
study.
it's not that Mills Mills did have an interest in understanding society, but what he was criticizing was that too many sociologists are going for what are called grand theories. That you're trying to. Now, this also is a problem in sociology, because in sociology, what we want to sort of have the kind of reliability, we want to be seen as a reliable and a valid science, right? Within the social sciences. And and because of that, I think it's important for sociologists to be able to try and understand what sort of universal laws of society could be, to try and posit certain universal ideas and laws of society. And the trouble is that, given the kind of fragmentations that you have in society, it's very difficult to come up with these sort of very broad universal laws. So if you're too caught up with moving towards, or trying to arrive at these broad universal laws, you may lose out on the real aim and focus of sociology. So what C. Wright Mills was saying is that many sociologists have actually moved away from the original idea of sociology. The original idea of the discipline, as Comte had told us, is that it must be it's a discipline that tries to understand social behavior in order to actually improve it. And that focus, the improving it focus, I think was getting lost. And Mills's concern was this, that we are no longer focusing on the whole idea of how should society be, right? What sorts of relations are problematic, what sorts of relations are oppressive, and how can we affect a change through understanding, right? If so, for instance, if I say, that if you think of let us take the example of caste. If you take the example of caste in sociology, you will see that for several years, the study of caste and the study of the caste system in India has actually been around a sort of more functionalist perspective, a perspective that really takes into account the dominant story, right? The story of the powerful, the narrative of the powerful. To give you a simple example, we know that Ambedkar has written about caste, but Ambedkar's writings on caste were never really a part of the syllabus in taught sociology courses till about maybe about, I don't know, 10 years ago. So when I was studying sociology, we didn't, Ambedkar was not a reading mentioned in our reading list. So you did not study, multiple perspectives in certain contexts. So that now this is a critique that has emerged from sociology itself and the discipline. So the good thing about the discipline is that it has that kind of reflexivity, that people reflect on what they're doing, how they're studying particular social phenomena. So if I think of Kant and I think of C. Wright Mills, what C. Wright Mills was doing was being reflexive about his discipline. He was being critical of his own discipline to say that, look, what we have done is possibly not the way forward, not the way in which the discipline was imagined originally. Vaibhav, the next slide. We've discussed this already, so I'm not going to get into it. Is that clear? Whoever asked the question, I don't know who asked the question.
Ma'am, I asked. Yes, ma'am, it was pretty much clear.
Okay. So, so now I want to move to just a couple of concepts that you will encounter, and that's ontology and epistemology. And once we do that, then we will talk about three broad theoretical perspectives within sociology. Now, ontology is, when I give you the reading on approaches, this is something that you will come across again and again. So I thought it's best to explain it first. So ontology is the question of what is the nature of reality, right? So it's the study of what exists, or the study of or developing an understanding of the fundamental nature of reality. Like what sorts of assumptions do we make about whatever we are studying? And if you think about reality and how we think of reality in the natural sciences, what do you think it is? How do you think of reality in the natural sciences? Anybody?
Is it that you are talking about the sciences, that natural science means that we had previously discussed, like Newton's law, something like that, in a bit reality, ma'am? I didn't understand the question.
Yeah. So the question, so really about, when you think of reality with regard to, reality is something that exists outside of you, right? It's, when you in the sciences, you observe the reality that is, you're not going to change that reality. Your presence in observing a natural phenomenon is not going to change what is going on. So if the apple falls from the tree, the apple is going to fall from the tree, irrespective of what you are doing. So when you say one position then in understanding reality is that it is independent, it works independently, exists and works independently of human beings and their interpretations of it. It doesn't matter what I think of what is happening. There is a particular cause and effect relationship which will be carried out irrespective of what my interpretation is. So the apple will fall from the tree into on the ground, and this is according to the laws of gravity, and it doesn't matter what my interpretation of it may be very different, but that is not going to affect or change this this particular law. Um, Now, if I ask you to, if I ask you to think about the reality, for instance, of your family, right? Each of you will come up with very different categories or characteristics of what happens in your family, right? So, in a sense, then, this understanding of reality is that your reality is what you make of it, how you interpret it, how you engage with it. So, this is a difference. In the natural sciences, when we think of reality, it is something that exists independently of human beings and their interpretations of it. But as students of sociology, we engage with reality as something that is as something that is deeply connected to our categories, to our interpretations, and to our interactions in that reality. So if I just think about research and you doing an experiment with this kind, an experiment in a laboratory with this kind of understanding of reality, and I think of a social science student, a sociologist, going to the field to study a particular phenomenon, uh, you will see that these are different interpretations. So the sociologist who goes into the field to study a particular phenomenon will, while observing people, is also being observed. While engaging with people, is also allowing herself to have a dialogue. So that dialogue is really about her interpretations also of what is going on. So at no point can you separate, when you're doing sociological analysis, you cannot separate your interpretation from that, what is called the objective reality. So it is at the same time objective and subjective. So, and we'll discuss this a lot more when we talk about approaches, but I just wanted to introduce this idea. Let's not get into the realist and nominalist and critical realist at this point. We'll discuss it when we discuss the approaches. Now, the next concept, so the first is, what is your theory or what is your understanding of reality? And the second is, which is ontology, and epistemology is what are your assumptions, what is your understanding of how knowledge is produced? How do you get the knowledge that you get? So, what is scientific knowledge? Where does it emerge from? And what does it look like? And how have we produced it? Right? So how do we know the things that we know about the world? This is connected to how we know reality, how we know what our reality is, and what assumptions we make about reality. So when I make the assumption that reality is objective, I will have a certain kind of study. When I make the assumption that reality is subjective, it's completely open to our interpretations, then I will, of course, arrive at an entirely different set of conclusions. So these questions of what we need to do to produce knowledge, what does scientific knowledge look like once we've produced it, and what sorts of, how do we know, what is the root of what we know about the world, and our claim that what we know is true. So this is basically the position of the understanding of epistemology. Now, clearly, you know that there are two sets of methods: the deductive and the inductive, right? So, if I think about the deductive and the inductive, that is connected to the question of how do you get the knowledge that you have. So, do you know what the deductive and inductive is? Anybody?
Now, in the inductive method, we usually assume for one specific and we will prove that for the entire uh, domain. That is what it is, inductive.
Deductive.
No, ma'am, I'm not sure about deductive.
Yeah. Other. So in the yours in the natural sciences, what kind of reasoning do you use? Inductive or deductive?
I think deductive.
Ma'am, A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C.
Yeah, so it's deductive, right? So you in a sense, what you're doing is you start with a hypothesis, you collect data to see whether your hypothesis is right or wrong. Yeah. Now, in inductive, what we do in sociology, this is something that you would do. You're considered inductive butterfly collectors, because what you do is you go from one interesting case to another, and you try and arrive at some sort of generalizations based on these individual cases, right? So the way in which, and of course, again, there is much more to deductive and inductive, just that, and I'm simplifying for you, but we will discuss this in greater detail. But what we are saying here is that, so these two aspects, the nature of reality and the context in which knowledge is produced, and the question of how do we know something is true, these two questions are central to any discipline. How do you view reality, and how do we know the world around us? How do we what is scientific knowledge, and how do we know it to be true? These two questions are central to any discipline. Yes, there's a hand up, Sanidhya.
Ma'am, how could be a I think hypothesis and be in deductive method, like we observe or like we assume something and then we conclude in a hypothesis, but like it should be an inductive method, na? Like we observe something and then we go to the final conclusion. There is no logical reasoning.
Inductive, actually, you don't necessarily have a hypothesis. You may have certain questions and concerns, but what you go with is with those questions. So you observe, and you will try and observe as many cases as possible, and then on the basis of those try and reflect on and analyze them to arrive at certain general conclusions. So you're moving from the particular to the general. Whereas in deductive, you're moving from the general to the particular.
But ma'am, all the theories or hypotheses should be in inductive now.
All the theories.
Like in theories we do what, like we observe and assume something and then we conclude to anything, like we conclude. But in deductive we have a logical reasoning, like
Yeah.
so you said like there is a hypothesis in deductive, like you said we just put the hypothesis in the deductive method, like.
So you're saying there is no hypothesis?
No, ma'am, I'm saying that the hypothesis should be in the tabulized in the inductive method, not in deductive.
Hypothesis should be in deductive, not in inductive, and not in deductive.
Deductive. Yes, ma'am.
But in deductive, don't you also, like, if I'm saying that, like somebody pointed out, if I say that A is equals to B,
Yes, ma'am.
right, it means I'm basing it on already existing knowledge. That's your hypothesis, isn't it?
Yes.
It's like, okay, I won't use the word hypothesis. Let's say that, in you on the basis of whatever has already been discovered. So this process of what is called falsification, conjectures and refutations, right? And this is the way in which science advances, that you have a conjecture, you say that possibly this is correct, and I want to see whether this is correct. So that's that's what I would call a hypothesis, that I conjecture. I have a statement, I make a statement, and then I try and go and see. I conduct experiments, I go to the field, and I try and see if this is correct. Now, this is not to say that it's not possible in sociology. Now, sociology also has both methods. It uses both methods of reasoning, right? So even in sociology, I can say that I can begin with the assumption that caste does not exist in urban society, right? And then have certain follow-up sort of propositions, which I then try and explore in society. And I'll have to figure out, of course, that's, given that, the way things are, that doesn't seem possible with that. So that's a bad example. But you could actually come up with certain conjectures that you want to test, whether that the conjecture that you made is correct or wrong based on certain kinds of data, right? Whereas I could also just have a more open question of how do people relate to caste in modern urban society? Yeah. And here what I do is I inductively observe, interpret, and reflect what people are doing, what they're saying about the question that I have raised. And for sociologists, it's important also to then reflect on how you engage with that particular question. What is your sense of what is going on in the field? So you don't, whatever you observe, the sociologist or the researcher is also implicated in whatever you observe, which is not the case, I suppose, when you're conducting an experiment. Now, typically it's not the case, but as a sociologist, we would argue that all these sites, even if you think of an experiment, it's actually in some way or the other contaminated, or, contaminated is a bad word, but in some way or the other, the social context will determine even a very sort of strictly defined procedure of an experiment. So, yeah, so then this question of, I don't know whether that answers your question, Sanidhya, but we could, we'll take it up in greater detail when we are doing the different approaches. So these, I want to leave you with these two concepts and move on to then just broadly discussing, next slide, please, broadly discussing the theoretical sort of positions within approaches within sociology. And again, this is a very, what should I say, a very basic kind of understanding of theory, or a very, very basic classification of the kinds of theories. Of course, there are several theories and theoretical approaches, but we can say that broadly, at this point, it's important for you to understand these three. So the first is the functionalist perspective, and the theorist that we will be studying in the functionalist perspective is Émile Durkheim, again, a French sociologist. So the functionalist perspective really is about how, how do social institutions function? This question of how social institutions function is addressed by really looking at the functions it performs. So when I say family or marriage, what sorts of functions do these institutions fulfill in society? And in any, and they, it will recognize, the perspective recognizes that in any society, institutions have to perform certain functions in order to survive. And broadly, the functions are in the realm of, firstly, in sort of replacing personnel. So whether you think of a family or in marriage or any context, the society or that group has to replace the personnel, the person who is, when a person leaves. So the function of filling the gap in the event of death or any other, incapacitation or any other such context, when a person leaves, how do you replace the personnel? So the institution performs the function of replacing personnel. it performs the function of socializing the young. It performs the function of training and recruiting new people. So they really, teaching people the right behavior within a particular institution. That's very clear in the example, for instance, of family, where individuals are socialized into becoming members of the family, also into becoming proper members of society in that sense. Then the third function is that of producing and distribution of goods and services. So so institutions play the role of coming up with the sets of rules and regulations which will allow sort of an easy and a proper distribution of goods and services with the intent that this process of distribution of goods and services actually serves to satisfy the needs of its members, right? The fourth is central, which is the preservation of order, that institutions preserve a sense of social order, and they kind of approach, or they kind of try to resolve the challenges that arrive, or that come up, that emerge in within a particular society. And those challenges may be from several disruptive sort of events. One disruptive event, again, is the death of a people. It could be the death of a culture through certain external forces. So it tries to, the institutions will try to retain a sense of order in society. And overall, then, these institutions perform the function of providing and maintaining a sense of purpose. So it gives people a sense of purpose as it fulfills these requirements. So, for instance, if I think about the state as an institution, or government as an institution, then we know that there are certain codes which the state will bring up. So codes of patriotism, codes of hard work, of cultural pride, all of these things are motivators for you to remain in the institution. So the institution is constantly trying to figure out what are the possible motivators for you to remain, because it is through this institution that there will be stability in society. So this is broadly the functionalist view, where you understand that society is about coming together with some kind of consensus about norms and values. Yes, Himanshu?
Ma'am, just now you tell about the institution. So, ma'am, can you just give some more example of institution? Like you just gave an example of state. Can we?
Yeah. So again, Himanshu, I'm just we will cover institutions in greater detail as we go along. I'm just presenting these as certain ideas at this point, but other institutions are, it could be family, it could be marriage, the education is an institution. All of these are institutions, and in each of these institutions, what we see overall is this urge to preserve a certain notion of stability and order. And how do they do this? All institutions perform, according to functionalists, perform this function of maintaining order and trying to keep this consensus about values and norms, because it is through this consensus that order will be maintained. So the functionalists will believe that conflict is not normal. Conflict is something that is dysfunctional, and the institution has to perform, again, the function of addressing conflict. So when if you have a student protest in a university, then the university authorities have to address the students, or they have to come up with ways of regulating this kind of what is considered to be disruptive behavior. So students are supposed to be in class. If you're not in class and you're protesting outside the VC's office, then that issue has to be addressed, right? That's a disruption of authority, a disruption of the values and norms of that institution. So, and there are several ways in which the institution then addresses that kind of disruption. But so all of these are examples of institutions. So one example is the state, but you could think about the family, you could think about marriage as an institution, kinship as an institution, caste as an institution, anything, so these are social contexts, spaces, sets of relations which govern how we will relate to each other, which govern how we will be in society. And in a sense, they all, in some way or the other, contribute to this overall coherence or consensus that we see as social order. Is that clear?
Yes, ma'am. And ma'am, so when we are talking about the institution, there are two main functions that it perform. One is to preserve the notion of stability, and second is to you just sort out the conflicts that is happening in the society.
Yeah.
So we can conclude that thing.
Yeah.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank
Overall, it's about maintaining the social order. So this is the functionalist perspective. The second perspective that I want to discuss, and if you remember the slide with the Vaibhav, could you go back to the slide with the theorists, with the names of the theorists? Yeah, so you see here the second perspective that we are discussing, it's referred to here as Marxism. I'm going to discuss it more broadly as the conflict perspective. But Karl Marx is the theorist that we are going to discuss in class. But conflict theorists are, yeah, we can go back to the slide on conflict and functionalism. So conflict theorists agree with this functionalist view that that social institutions are organized in order to meet basic social needs and in order to maintain a certain kind of order. But what they object to is the fact that this kind of perspective, this kind of understanding may not necessarily be efficient or desirable. So basically what conflict theorists state is that functionalist theories avoid conflict. They consider conflict as not normal, conflict as dysfunctional or are pathological, and conflict theories consider conflict to be central to society and how society is, because according to conflict theories, people come together in society with conflicting values and goals. There is ruthless competition, resources are scarce, so conflict is normal, and you cannot think of conflict as a kind of as this kind of disruption. In fact, what they say is that what do the major institutions do in this kind of context? They just maintain the order as per the powerful. So order as the powerful see it, as powerful individuals and groups perceive order, that is what is maintained. So if I think of norms and values, in fact, there isn't a general consensus over norms and values. It is a consensus that is appropriated. It is a consensus that only the powerful have, and that consensus is then imposed on those who are powerless. So so what major institutions do is that they maintain the privileges of the powerful and at the cost of the powerlessness of people. So when you maintain these kinds of privileges, it implies the powerlessness of certain groups of people. So if you think about an example of this, I think if you think of education as an institution, you could see this right from the early sort of years of education, and all of us have experienced this in India, for instance, the division of early education or school education between public and private education, right? And you know that the kinds of access, and of course some of this is changing now, but broadly the kind of access that that government schools have, the kind of infrastructure that government schools have, is very different from the larger sort of private schools, and in terms of access to opportunities, access to resources, there is a lot more. So in fact, what happens is that education then is oriented towards maintaining the divisions in society, so that those who are poor and are not able to afford the more expensive private schools are deprived of the kind of access to opportunities that these private schools provide. And then they have to, so they're actually forced to sort of be in the government system. And again, as I said, I'm sure there are examples which prove otherwise. I mean, so for instance, I had done a study in Andhra Pradesh once where, in fact, the private schools and people were sending, their children to private schools, but many of these private schools were just sort of very small organizations, with often with untrained teachers, and it is the government schools that had better trained teachers and so on. But people still preferred to send their children to private schools because they felt that it was offering something that these government schools weren't, in terms of discipline, in terms of ensuring that classes were being held, and so on and so forth. So I think that if you think about the infrastructure in that context, where there were several private schools which were sort of small, classes being held in little sheds, 2 or 3 separate classes, like classes 3, 4, 5 all together in one room. So all of that was happening in the private schools, whereas the government schools actually had a lot more infrastructure. So there was a difference there. But despite this, I think generally speaking, we see that education can be seen as an institution that actually replicates the social divisions, the divisions in society. So this is what conflict theorists would argue, that it replicates the divisions of caste and class and gender and region and so on. And so then what these conflict theories are saying is that you must look at institutions as having an inherently conservative nature, as not being able to take on sort of or to establish very radical values. So when you look at it from the functionalist perspective, you see that it is, institutions are often very dysfunctional, but they continue to operate in the same dysfunctional manner. This consensus, this apparent consensus about values and norms is basically, it's false. It's not something that is a real consensus. So what they tend to do is that they tend to replicate the gendered, the racist, the casteist environments within which they operate. They do not actually challenge it. And what conflict theories are trying to say is that you have to look at society as a space where conflict is normal, where people are sort of fighting over each other for scarce resources, and that's your real understanding of society. So to think of conflict as a sort of minor disruption in social order, and then which is very quickly replaced by that equilibrium and that by a return to a social order, that is problematic according to conflict theorists. And you'll see that when we talk about Karl Marx, where he basically begins by saying that that conflict is sort of at the root or at the center of our understanding of society. And for him, the primary conflict is the conflict between classes. So it's class conflict that he's referring to, and he talks about two classes: the owners of the means of production and the non-owners. So those who own means of production and those who work for those who own the means of production, the haves and the have-nots. Yes, Himanshu.
Ma'am, so Karl Marx theory was based on the conflict.
Was based on conflict. He understood
ma'am-
that, yeah.
And ma'am, the theory that Mill and the Comet has stated was based on the functionalism perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, ma'am.
So we'll, again, we will discuss some of these concepts and ideas in detail. At this point, it's enough to leave you with this sort of broad picture of the functionalist and the conflict theory. And the third is what is called symbolic interactionism, or the interactionist perspective. And it begins with this idea that reality is socially constructed, that that social institutions, the way in which we are in these social institutions and the way in which social institutions affect us, this is a two-way process. It's a dialogic process. So social institutions affect our own behavior in So as a sociologist, what we would do is that we would try and think about how people, ask the question of how people engage with each other to make their realities. So it's important for us in the symbolic interactionist perspective to look at interaction. So you see, I'm no longer looking at sort of either at function or at conflict. I know that both of these are present in society, but how they are present and how they affect us or how they affect the institution is about the interaction. What sorts of interactions prevail between people and institutions. So as I gave you the example of family, each of our experiences of the family is different. The way in which we will articulate what the family means to us will be different. So the reality of the family as an institution is different for each of us, even though you may say that, okay, there are certain norms or certain ideas which are common to all, right? So so the interactionist perspective is really about looking at the everyday behavior in order to understand how things function, and in order to understand how things like aspects like order, aspects like consensus, and aspects such as conflict are present in people's lives and the way in which people engage with each other and with these institutions. So there was a sociologist, Michel Danier, who does a study, for instance, on the social behavior of these women who worked in a large Chicago law firm. And so this is just an example to show you what it means when you do a study which focuses on interactionism, which focuses on people's interactions. So he was interested in in the question of what sorts of informal networks are present and what sorts of informal social norms are there in this work environment. And he describes this place where these large, they're all women, women who work as word processors. So this is a sort of large room which is windowless, and in this building where there are 7 other floors that the law firm occupies. Now, what happens is that he describes how work assignments are placed in a central basket, and then there are very precise instructions that these women are given in terms of how they have to complete the work. So he says that if you look at the context in which this work is set up, you will realize probably that the women have very little agency. The women have very little choice or very little agency in what they're doing. And it would also seem that they have very little social contact between each other. But when he draws from an interactionist perspective, when he begins to sit and observe the everyday behavior of these women, he finds that they have several private moments for conversations. they have a very critical view of the lawyers and the other people who work in the office. And so for instance, they would consider the secretaries to be lazy. They would resent the superior attitudes of the lawyers. And so the interactionist perspective then basically is about trying to understand how our social behavior and our social perspective really shapes the way in which we accept the roles and statuses that are assigned to us. So you could think of this when you see this person who works in a word processing job in a law firm, and somebody who is how should I put it, completely aligned or completely accepted the job that she's in, right? So that's one view of what you're seeing, right? Of what is the reality. But when I try and observe their everyday behavior, and I see that okay, they are party to conversations and conversations, and they have views and opinions about each other, about the other people working in the office, which go against the grain of the passivity that they reflect. So they may come across as passive workers who agree with whatever has been laid out for them as work. But when you speak to them, then you realize that there is a lot more going on. So that what you're saying is that there is a formal sort of way of producing this worker, and there are also these informal networks which come up, which you can see when you see people interacting, when you focus on this idea that the reality is made through interactions. Now, this will be true of, again, if you look at any work environment, you will find aspects like this. So at first glance, or if I take a functionalist perspective, then I look at the work environment as contributing to a certain kind of order where a certain amount of work that is assigned is being fulfilled. So if I look at a factory and I see people producing soaps, for instance, I would say that, okay, like 10 people are producing 100 soaps in an assembly line production in a day. And so I see that as a kind of order and a kind of efficiency. What I'm not able to see is what they think about the job that they're doing, how they, and each of this affects who you are and how you, what your position is in the institution. Again, to give you an example from the work scenario, there's a very famous study which was done, which is called the Hawthorne experiment, in which what they did was that they, in a particular factory, they took a certain group of people out and they put them in sort of better working conditions. So there was more light, there was a larger room, and they had more breaks in between and so on, in order to see if better working conditions really improves efficiency and improves production. Now, what they found was that these better working conditions did not really improve production. Production remained the same. Now, that led to the understanding that there are these informal networks. They gathered that that the workers actually engaged in a kind of arrangement where they said you would only produce this and no more. And anybody who was producing more, there were negative sort of sanctions in terms of their connection to the larger group. So now these were the ways in which workers were themselves monitoring and regulating the situation. So even though the management wanted to find ways of ensuring that, wanted to find ways of increasing production, the workers would not let it happen. They had set a band. So they had set a certain parameter beyond which you basically tried not to produce beyond that set parameter. So these were all all of this points to the importance of everyday interactions and the importance of everyday interactions in constructing reality. And so if you think of reality as a set of rules and regulations and people behaving according to those rules and regulations, that is not enough. That is what you would do if you were taking the functionalist perspective. For interactionists, it's important to look at everyday behaviors and what sorts of meanings people attach to these everyday behaviors, because that is what really gives us an understanding of the institution and of people's roles within the institution. Yes, Himanshu.
Ma'am, just now you had discussed about that Hawthorne experiment in which we are just in which the conclusion is that better working condition does not has a huge impact on efficiency. So, ma'am, what was the next thing? Like you said, a worker set a parameter that they don't work beyond or they won't produce beyond a certain limit. So, like, what was the conclusion about that, ma'am? I didn't get thoroughly. So, can you
So
explain
the
that?
conclusion, I mean, the conclusion of the study was that better working conditions didn't lead to increase in production or increase in efficiency, right? So that, I mean, if you incentivized it through better working conditions, that is something that would not work in this case. Now, what I was trying to draw from that study is to use it to speak about interactionism and interactionist perspective, which basically says that you cannot look at the worker as somebody who's merely following the rules and regulations. So from a functionalist perspective, that's how I would see the worker, right? As somebody who's, and that was the example that I gave of this law firm where there were these women who were working there who were just, if you observe these women sitting in this large room doing their work on these computer screens, they would appear to be docile workers who were just following the rules of that institution, right? And maintaining order and keeping to their deadlines. But if you looked at the interactions, you have a whole other picture of roles and statuses in this space. So, I may be very subservient when I speak to, so one of those women could be very subservient when they spoke to a law attorney or they spoke to a senior or something. But actually what they felt and how they articulated their own being in this space would be very different. So you cannot understand what is important for you is to not just see the external manifestations of behaviors, but to look beyond that external manifestation to the meanings that people attach. So the meanings in the context of the Hawthorne experiment, the meanings that people attached to work was that you could actually subvert what the authorities wanted you to do. So the authorities wanted you to produce more, but you subverted this. But what is interesting is that this was found out in the course of this experiment, right? The experiment was, okay, people should produce more. The understanding was that they would produce more, but they didn't. And in trying to make them produce more, what was discovered was something else. What was discovered is the informal social networks that govern the workplace. So you have a formal set of rules and regulations, and if you just looked at those formal set of rules and regulations, you would see order, you would see that production was as per schedule, according to time, and so on. Then you uncover this informal social network, and you see that there is a lot more going on in this work environment.
Yes, ma'am, I understood.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, it is clear.
Okay. Yes, Jahnavi?
Ma'am, if they were told that they will be in this work environment, if they are giving like 10% more production, then they would have worked better and produced 10% more. Isn't that so?
Yeah,
If they were
so-
told that they will get back to the bad working conditions if they didn't increase the production by 10%.
Yeah. So then, I'm sure we can speculate what would have happened if it was incentivized differently. So the incentive in this case was better working condition, right? And to try and see if you have more light, if you have better breaks in between the shifts, if you have, if you have a cleaner workspace, if all of those things automatically lead to increase in production, right? Um, so that is, so now one can argue that there could be several reasons why you are not told increase 10% production, because if I'm told increase 10% production, I know very clearly that there is an increase in profit, and I may ask for better wages and so on and so forth. So what you were trying to, so the management is also trying to subvert in this case, right? So I can simply say that, you produce more, I will pay you more, but I'm not doing that. I'm just trying to tweak the existing condition a little bit in order to get what I need, right? So of course, if they would have incentivized in terms of salary, things may have been different, right? You produce more, I will pay you more. Things may be different. There will be some who will produce more, even with worse, with bad working conditions, or even with the earlier working conditions. So I think what we are trying to focus on here is that uh, um, what actually happens on the ground. When I take the interactionist perspective, I'm able to understand this kind of social, this kind of focus on everyday behavior and everyday interactions as crucial to how institutions are. So the workspace, if I think of the work environment, if I think of the factory as an organization, as a larger industry, as a larger institutional space, then I know that that is not simply affected by the norms and regulations. It is affected by what I, as an individual worker, do within that space. So the everyday behaviors of workers is significant in understanding what the work environment looks like, what happens in the work environment. So the roles and statuses that are granted to us within an organization, those are uh, mm, mm, those can be very different, those can appear very differently when you're looking at everyday behaviors, when you're understanding that this reality that you see is actually being constructed as you go along. So that, that was really the focal point of giving you that example. Any other questions? So, did you read up on Industrial Revolution and French Revolution? Anybody who read up and wants to say something about it?
Yes, ma'am. Not actually reading, but I saw some videos on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, ma'am. There are certain differences between the Industrial Revolution of England, which is certainly different from other revolution. The first thing that I think that the most significant difference between our lifestyle has come from the first industrial revolution. Earlier, we worked in farms and other household works, but after that, most of the profession were based on factories and machineries, and urbanization increase means most of the cities that we see today are a result of that first industrial revolution. And many other and it gave birth to many of the ideologies too, like socialism, capitalism, and other things as well. And one more prominent feature which I observed is that there was no notion or no concept of middle class earlier than that. There were either factory owners or workers, but the middle class emerged out of that. I mean, it was a set of group which were professional and working with those machines. So a middle class emerged out of that. I think this is the most relatable features for most of us.
Okay. Okay, that's good. What about French Revolution? Anybody? So can this be the task for next week? Please, somebody, can you watch videos, read up a little bit on the French Revolution? I mean, also the Industrial Revolution. We want some more of you to speak.
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah, so for Monday. Now, one of the things that I wanted to clarify is that now tomorrow is a holiday, right? So we have to figure out how we do the tute.
Ma'am, I think on Saturday it's Friday's timetable.
What? Saturday
Yes,
is
ma'am.
Friday timetable. Okay, so then the tute will be on Saturday.
Ma'am, one more thing. Ma'am, in the course policy, it was mentioned that 25 marks are of tutorial response notes. So, ma'am, in the Moodle, it was showing that we have to submit, we have to watch a video, and then we have to submit the summary of that. So, ma'am,
Yeah.
it was based on the tutorial response notes. So we have to do it on a weekly basis.
Yeah, you have to do on weekly basis.
Okay, ma'am. And ma'am, the same thing we will discuss on the Friday in the tutorial
Yeah.
slots.
You come, you watch the video, and you come to the tutorial. We will discuss the tutorial. We will discuss the video, and we will connect it to whatever we've been doing in class, and then you write about it. I don't want you to write. You know, generally a response note is about what you think about what you saw and what was discussed. So the idea is to not sort of write a general summary of it, but to write about your response to it. How do you relate to this?
Okay, ma'am. And ma'am, the deadline was given in the 19th, like today is midnight. So ma'am, I have a tute on Friday, and
No,
so
deadline.
day after tomorrow.
It says you start from, submission can start from the 19th. The deadline will be till this next Saturday.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So I will see some of you today for the tutorial, and the last group will come on Saturday at 1 o'clock, and then Monday we have our class. And I will share with you the 2 PPTs that we've discussed these 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.